Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Larry Workman. I work for the Quinault Indian Nation. I began working for the Quinaults in 1974 in the forestry program, and over the years I evolved into working as a communications manager, which I am currently. In our program today, we're going to briefly look at some of the natural history, the cultural history, and then how the reservation came about, some of the events that happened on the reservation, and what the Quinaults have been doing since then, and where we are today. So with that, we can begin our presentation. Quinaults are very attached to the natural resources, so you'll see a lot about fisheries and forestry programs in this presentation today. So this program is entitled Quinault Country from Peak to Sea, because Quinault Country extends far beyond the reservation, as you'll see in this program. So the Quinault Reservation contains about 208,000 acres. It's on the southwest corner of the Olympic Peninsula, and that's about 330 square miles if you were to measure it in miles. And we're definitely on the wet side of the Cascade Mountains. The Olympic Mountains have a profound effect on the weather patterns here. They block the wet maritime clouds coming off the ocean. And we have about 100 inches of rain along the coast. At Lake Quinault, we have upwards of 140 inches of rain, and more in some years. And the Quinault River Valley actually has upwards of 240 inches of rainfall in the upper watershed. So it's a very wet climate here. Yet, when you cross over the Olympic Mountains to the Squim area, we have the driest area outside of Southern California. They have about 15 inches of rain or less up there. So the Olympic Peninsula is very rugged. It has very rugged core of mountains in the center with plains around the outer edges. And superimposed over this is many types of ownership, from federal, state, private, and industrial landowners. The Olympic National Park contains nearly 1 million acres, and it's basically the center of the peninsula as well as a coastal strip. The Olympic National Forest, with multiple uses, rings the park like a necklace. And then the state lands are the bright colored areas. And then the unmarked land is a private land holders, mostly industrial timber companies in our region. Olympic National Park is also a World Heritage Site because of its unique environment and cultural history. And the waters off the coast in 1992 were established as the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. So we have a lot of federal programs and properties and attitudes all around the Olympic Peninsula. Tohola is the major seat on the Quinault Reservation where the tribal government is located. We have about 23 miles of coastline, and as I said earlier, about 208,000 square acres on the reservation. At one time it was dominated by old-growth forests composed of primarily western red cedar with citrus spruce and hemlock. However, most of the forest has been logged, as you'll see in this presentation, and today we have second-growth forest over much of the reservation. As a result of a lot of work that we've been doing over the last 50 years. Some of the land on the reservation is very wet, and about 5% of the base is under what's called prairies. These are old bogs that were lakes that were left by the glaciers and that filled in to form these bogs. And they were very important traditional food gathering areas. We don't have too many hardwoods on the reservation. This is really conifer forest land that you'll see here. We do have hardwoods though, and pretty much they're limited to the river bottoms in the Quinault and the Queets rivers. Hardwoods are the trees like alder, cottonwood, and maple, the trees that lose their leaves in the wintertime. Now, if we were to turn the hands of the clock back about 25,000 years ago and visited this area, I've outlined the reservation boundaries here, but you can see glaciers came down out of the Quinault, the Queets, and the Humptuous valleys and spread out across what became the reservation. And it formed a wide Piedmont plain, so most of the land features are glacial features. As the glaciers begin to retreat, they left in their wake a lot of gravelly deposits and landforms. And they begin to evolve from an open country And at this time, when the Quinaults were here, they were mostly land mammal hunters. They hunted land on the land. But the forest gradually, over eons of time, began to develop forest. Until about 5,000 years ago, we had the forest that we're so familiar with today. These are the old-growth cedar forest. These are unique forests. They're the classical conifer forests. They're noted for the great size they grow to. Trees 300 foot tall. They grow upwards of 1,000 years old. And of course, conifers dominate by nearly 90% of the land base is under conifer growth. Lake Quinault was also created as the glaciers were retreating. They formed a large moraine, which is a pile of rubble left at the end of the glacier. And so Lake Quinault was formed as the glaciers were retreating back into the mountains. Now, if you go on the coast from here northwards up toward the Quinault area, you know we have wide sandy beaches south of Point Grenville. Point Grenville is a major dividing line, culturally and geologically. The tribes to the south of Point Grenville did not go to the sea and hunt sea mammals, but the tribes to the north of Point Grenville did go and hunt sea mammals. And the coastline is also much more rugged as you go north of Point Grenville compared to here south of Point Grenville. And as I said, the Quinaults did go to the sea to hunt sea mammals such as whales. And they were the southernmost tribe. But since the Quinaults were located here at Point Grenville, they shared in the cultures of the tribes to the north as well as the tribes to the south. So they, in many ways, were a bicultural nation to begin with. The Quinaults were known as the people of the salmon because there's 5 species of salmon that run into the Quinault River and provide almost a year-round food supply, which made the Quinaults very rich. They were also known as people of the cedar tree because every part of the western red cedar was used. Its foliage, its bark, its wood, its roots, in dyes, clothing, housing, canoes. So this is a typical longhouse that you would have found on the Quinault Reservation many, many years ago. Well, things began to change in the 1770s. When the Spanish first arrived, they were the first European contact that was made with Quinaults in 1775. And of course, at that time, that was the same time the American Revolution was beginning on the East Coast. Here, we were just making first contacts. But soon, many other ships were moving into the area, and the Quinaults often referred to these people on these ships as Boston, because most of these ships were out of Boston. They didn't have the B sound, so it came out as Bostons. So the non-Indians were known as Bostons then. Then the Lewis and Clark expedition came out this way and down the Columbia River and began to make notes about what was found here in this part of the world. And these are actually all Quinault Indians playing the roles of the Lewis and Clark expedition for a film that was made back in the 1960s. So there's many Quinaults there that are still around here today. Then the United States government undertook the first scientific expedition it ever had done in the early 1850s. And it was called the John Wilkes Expedition. They went to Antarctica, Hawaiian Islands, and they came to Puget Sound and down Grays Harbor. Many of the place names we find around our area today came from this expedition. This expedition produced a lot of drawings and details, accounts, and maps of the area. These were published back on the East Coast a few years later. And following this time is when the Oregon Trail opened up because of the Willamette Valley. The Oregon Territory had been created. Then a few years after the Oregon Territory was created, the lands north of the Columbia River were divided out and became the Washington Territory. And so Isaac Stevens was our first territorial governor. And his main job duty was to make treaties with the Indians to open up land for settlers. and to begin surveying the land into township and ranges. So, on July 1st, 1855, they did make a treaty with the Quinaults. Basically, they exchanged much of the west side of the Olympic Peninsula, that would have been Lake Quinault, and let the river come down. So they exchanged this for a right to fish at their usual and custom areas, and also to have a reservation land, which was established following this treaty. Of course, the Civil War came along in the 1860s, and it slowed things down very briefly. But right after the Civil War, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, and that stimulated more migration to the Pacific Northwest. And under Indian agents, the lifestyle of the Quinaults began to change quite drastically. Much of their culture was forbidden by these Bureau of Indian Affairs people, or it was called Indian Affairs back then. And so the clothing styles changed, the way of fishing changed, and children were often sent to boarding schools. And they were forbidden to speak their language, and there was many other things they weren't allowed to practice because the agents thought that this was not the proper way for people to be under the American society. Well, gold was then discovered in California, later on in the Yukon and Alaska, and this brought even more people there. Matter of fact, the founders of Hopewind were originally gold seekers, and so this brought more people into the region. In the 1880s, the federal government decided to make Indians into farmers, and so they subdivided Indian reservations up into 80-acre allotments on agricultural land and 160 for grazing lands. Here on the reservation, all the land was broken up into 80-acre allotments. And that began in 1909, even though the act is in fact in the 1880s. And so there was a little farming tribe, but mostly it's down in the river bottoms where there's silty soils. Most of the soils here have a lot of clay in them, and they're very acid, and it does not go good for agricultural crops, but it goes great for growing conifer trees. So conifer forests are still one of the main resources on the reservation lands. In the late 1880s, they began using oxen to log much of the land in the Grays Harbor area. And then they also began to dam up the rivers with these splash dams. Every river in Grays Harbor County had a splash dam on them, with the exception of the Quinault River. Some rivers, like the Hump-Tulps rivers, had upwards of 15 of these dams on them and its tributaries. And the idea was they'd log the land, dump in the logs into the riverbed, then open up the floodgates and flush the logs down to the mills on the harbor. And these are called splashes, and they were often pretty dramatic and did a lot of damage to the salmon resources. Well, the railroad appeared on the scene at the turn of the century in about 1900, and they began to move on to the Quinault Reservation in 1922 to log. And they were doing these under contracts with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Eventually, spiderweb, the railroad was just spiderwebbing all across the southern part of the reservation under contracts with many different companies. There was Polson up near the lake area, Aloha, near Oak Cliffs, and M.R. Smith, as well as the Hobie. So these were the major contractors logging under contracts set up by the BIA. And the idea was it would be cheaper to use railroad logging because you log whole blocks at the same time instead of just small individual ones. And the loggers were pretty much after western red cedar. Red cedar is a very valuable tree to the tribal people as well as to the loggers. It's a very resilient wood, it works very fine, and it's very decay resistant. Often trees such as hemlock, you can see it's simple here, but hemlock were called weed trees, and they were just left to rot on the ground, and they would take out the seed. Of course, hemlock eventually became the Cinderella tree, and a very important tree, and it's also the state tree of Washington now. So following these logging operations by railroad, there was vast amounts of slash and debris from fallen trees and broken limbs and trees. So these often caught on fire even in 1922, right after they started logging. But 1941 was a very large fire, and it burned much of the southern part of the reservation. This could have been caused by lightning or railroad sparks, but it did spread and burned for 4 months. There was one Indian agent, a forester by the name of Henry Steer, that thought tree planting would work. And there was, at that time, they weren't allowed to plant trees on individually allotted land, but they could on tribal land. So he set up about 2,000 acres on the reservation, called it the Experimental Forest, and this was the first big landholding that the Quinault Nation as a nation held of its own. And so they began planting trees in 1929 to 1933. And this was the first tree planting ever done in this region. He used local crews. They pulled up seedlings off of railroad right-of-ways and transplanted them into the experimental forest. He even tried some exotic species, sequoia and redwoods, which are still in the experimental forest to this day. The federal policy changed from clear-cut to selective harvest in the 1930s. And here you can see they're dragging these logs out of the forest, but this was very damaging to the forest. And in almost all cases, the windstorms blew down the rest of the stands when they logged in this manner within a few years. And basically they were hybriding. They were taking out the best and leaving the rest, and it was not a very good practice. So log trucks appeared on the scene in the late 1930s, early 1940s, and they began to dictate how the logging blocks would be set up after that date. No longer was railroad logging so important. And log trucks still we still use log trucks to this day on the reservation. Now, if we look at the cutout on the reservation, you can see most of it was western red cedar. This is all the old growth. Hemlock is here, but it would have even been more had they taken it off in the early years. They didn't start taking it until later on in the logging. And you can see all the other species, spruce, Doug fir, and pine, were very minor species in the original forest mix. In our new second growth forest, hemlock and Doug fir will probably be the two major species. And you can see when they started logging back in the 20s, they did a lot of logging. It dropped off in the 30s. Then beginning in the 1950s was major logging. So in one person's lifetime, the forests on the Quinault Reservation were liquidated. And this was because the BIA felt they needed to get the money to the landowners. But they were working with these loggers, and so things did not always go the way they should have. In the 1950s, under the Eisenhower administration, the policy again changed, and they began to terminate Indian reservations and move Indians off of the reservations because they said the jobs are in the cities, we'll move the people to the city. And that's why Seattle and Portland have very large native populations, is because of this policy in the 1950s. And at the same time, it did a lot of damage on the reservation because of fee lands, which we'll be talking about here when they were trying to terminate some of the reservations. So in the 1960s, more and more Quinaults were going to colleges and universities and coming back and seeing that the situation on the reservation was quite dire. Entire watersheds had been logged over, vast amounts of slash, broken trees had been left behind, and the Forest Service did a study and found that nearly 220 tons of wood remained following a logging operation on the average site. So there was still a lot of wood left on the land even after they were done logging. They logged across streams and rivers. But there were leaders of the Quinault at that time, Joe Delacruz, Jim Jackson, and Guy McMines, and working together, they formulated a plan to develop a natural resource program. And they also began to say that they had jurisdiction over the reservation. There has been a lot of people going to Point Grimble and surfing. They were leaving trash. They were painting graffiti on the rocks. And so in 1969, they closed the beaches to the public. And this was to show they had jurisdiction within the boundaries of the reservation and could control that. In 1971, they took another step, and they closed the logging roads and blockaded them to the loggers because they saw a lot of problems that were occurring on the reservation. Some of these were damage to fisheries. There was no reforestation going on. They were being paid poor prices for the timber on the reservation. There were 14 other, mostly environmental issues that the tribe was looking at. This resulted in a suit called the Mitchell case. And that was to show that the case was brought against the federal government for mismanagement of trust responsibility. And the government eventually said that there was a breach of trust responsibility. 1975 was the Indian Self-Determined and Educational Assistance Act. Often in Indian country it's referred to as Public Law 638. And this was the first step that the government gave where the tribes could take some of the funds and set up their own agenda. It wouldn't be always done by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So with these funds, the tribe then looked at their fisheries program because they had been working under Ford Foundation grant and Economic Development grant to manage fisheries. So with the 638 funds, they figured they could step right into the fisheries management program and begin to manage that more effectively. They did a lot of studies, such as electroshocking, where you shock the water and then you can pick up the little fish and count them, or you can put nose tags in them, so when they come back as adults, you can tell where that fish came from. And the fisheries program takes a lot of people. Salmon are always moving around in and out on their migration. So it takes a lot of staff to collect the data to know what's going on with the fish population, the salmon population. They did establish some hatcheries. This hatchery is on Salmon River, which is a tributary of the Quinault River. And we also have a hatchery called Pin Rearing Facility at Lake Quinault. And so we rear the fish in the same river they come from and release them in the same river. We don't move them from river to river. There's also a federal hatchery under Fish and Wildlife called the Cook Creek Hatchery or the Quinault National Hatchery. And they work cooperatively with the Quinaults on the fish releases there. So then, like I was saying, the fish are then released into the streams and rivers. They also have harvest management to ensure that there's no over-harvesting when the nets are in the river and out of the river to allow for escapement. So we have natural spawning in the streams as well as at the hatcheries. In 1974 was the Bolt decision. This was a case brought from the federal government against Washington State that said that Quinaults and other tribes had signed treaties saying that they were allowed to fish in their usual and custom areas, and the state had been preventing Quinaults from fishing off the reservation. They were even trying to regulate on reservation. So this was a very important decision, the Bolt decision. So it allowed Quinaults also then to fish off the coast in an area called the UNA, usual and custom area. And on this map you can see the reservation. The UNA includes the Quinault River, the Quinault River, the Hub Tulips River, here, and all the drainage into the Chehalis River. So these were traditional areas where Quinaults hunted, fished, and did other activities. It covers about 2,500 square miles. So the Quinaults have an expansion far beyond just the reservation. And so in these UNA areas, they manage cooperatively with the state and federal government, and they also fish throughout these areas. Now, Grays Harbor is within this UNA, and so activities which occur on the harbor are very important to the Quinaults because it affects the off-reservation fisheries. And for example, you heard about the pontoon project. When it was originally established, Farm was there to help break the ground. They work with us very closely because we have a lot of fishermen out in front of that area. And matter of fact, today, the last two pontoons of the project have been taken out they were supposed to have been moved out this morning, so I'm assuming they have met their schedule. And so that project is just nearly complete. We also work with shell fisheries, razor clams, and we dig all along the coast, again, on a management schedule for harvest. And all these products, many of these products then go into the Quinault Tribal Fish House in Taholah. And it is here where we recirculate the dollar. The fish isn't just being sold and that's it. We're trying to have job opportunities for Quinaults to process the fish and package it and market it. So this creates the dollar working over and over. Now, one of the most important fish to the Quinaults of the 5 salmon species is the Quinault blueback salmon. It's a type of sockeye. It's very unique to the Quinault River. It only runs on the Quinault River, no other river. And this is one of the fish that made the Quinault people so rich and well known, is because of this particular salmon, which is so flavorful. They spawn above Lake Quinault in a 10-mile section of the river and all the tributaries which drain into it. But when you look at what's happening, you can see that it once was a very large run, and now we're a very small amount of fish coming in compared to early in the 1900s. So what's causing this? Is it overfishing or what? And a lot of it we feel is habitat degradation. This is Lake Quinault. This is the 10-mile section here of the river where the blueback spawn, and also in all these little channels. So when settlers began to move here in the 1900s, they began to clear forest. They removed log jams in the river so they could improve navigation. And the river went a little bit wild. There was also road building. Another problem that faces us today is land ownership. Here's the lake, here's that 10-mile section right here. We have Forest Service, National Park, and then mostly private landholdings right along the river. So we're trying to work with these to do something to the river to reestablish it. This is what the Quinault River should have looked like before the 1900s. It had many channels through forested islands. But today, because of all the logging that occurred and the things that happened, the Quinault River is on the wide gravel bed. It does not have these forested islands any longer like it once had. And so the river, when we have freshets, high water, kind of goes wild, and it whiplashes all across this gravel bed and takes out other areas, roads and everything. So one of the things we've done is started the Quinault Rehabilitation Project. It's a long-term project, maybe 100 years long, where we'll put it in artificial log jams. We call these engineered log jams, ELJs. And by putting these in, we can begin to form hard areas where it can collect wood and begin to form islands behind it. We plant trees on these to help speed up the natural succession. And so, like I said, it's a very long-term project, maybe 100 years long, but more than a person's lifetime, to reclaim the river and stabilize it. So not only is there spawning areas for blueback, for other species of salmon as well. Well, fishing is traditionally and culturally very important to the Quinaults. Economically, the forest resource may be more important because it not only affects the forest lands, but also the quality of the water that's in the streams and rivers for the salmon. So we only started our forestry program in 1974. Before that, the BIA had a logging program and a token tree planting program. There was not much going on. So the Quinaults, that's the time I started, is when we began to look at other programs from the Forest Service, the state, private timber companies, even British Columbia, and how they were managing programs. Well, we didn't have much of an inventory, so one of the first things we did was turn to Landsat through the Bendix Corporation in Michigan and begin to try to see what we could get a general idea of what the conditions of the lands were from satellite. So this is a map of the Quinault Reservation here. This is the Quinault River up to the lake. So the red is alder, hardwood forest, blue are brush fields, and the orange are second growth forest. And you can, if you remember that railroad map, this is all the stuff that was logged by railroad. Everything else has been logged by truck. So this was the Taholah unit, 30,000 acres. There's yellow is bare slash, blue is brush, and then the dark green are the old growth forest. So you can see all the clear cuts are running together to form one vast clear cut, basically. If If you look at the Forest Service, they had small clear cuts scattered. State lands had larger clear cuts, but still they were scattered. No one had the situation we had on the Quinault Reservation. So as we began to develop this forestry program, we needed more tools. So this was our first tool. Our next tool, we worked with Weyerhaeuser to do a soil survey on the reservation and map out the soils, because that helps you know what you can and can't not do to different soil types. So we recognized we had a very good opportunity here if we could clear away some of the brush and plant trees. Well, at the start, the only thing the Bureau of Indian Affairs would allow the Quinaults to do was called scarification, where you take in a bulldozer and move the brush and just slash to the side to open up the ground. But we have a lot of clay, we have a lot of acid soils, and you can't do this on wet soils. You have to have dry sites, so it's very limited. We looked at prescribed burning, which was very commonly used back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s throughout our area. Any of you who lived here at that time, remember any nice time we had a nice summer day, there would be a big smoke plume going up somewhere. And this was prescribed burning, where you burn 50, 100 acres all at the same time. And this helps prevent wildfires by burning under controlled conditions. So in 1978, the Secretary of Interior visited the Quinault Reservation. His name was Cecil Andrews. And as Secretary of Interior has authority over Indian reservation trust properties throughout the country. So when we were doing things, we have to go through the Department of Interior. So within a year of his visit, we had a prescribed burning program. The BIA said we couldn't do it, there was too much complication of land ownership and too much slash, but we ended up burning. And we burned about 2,000 acres a year. We created a quilt work pattern all across the reservation. We had helicopter ignition systems and this. And this mostly burns out all the fine material, opens up the ground so you can plant trees, and then we can avoid potential of a wildfire racing across the reservation because we've removed a lot of the finer debris. So some of these were very dramatic, sending up big clouds. Today we don't do much prescribed burning any longer because mostly that was in the old growth, and their quality standards have also changed. So we still do burn piles in the fall, but still this is a problem. It's sort of a waste of material, and it also pollutes the air and creates air stagnation. So what can we do with this besides burning the piles to get rid of it? And one of the things we're looking at is called a biomass project. They have it already in Forks. This is at the Forks School, and they use all the waste debris to come in and burn it in an incinerator, running piping water through it, and they heat the school with this system. So we're hoping that we can no longer have to burn piles, but if we establish this program, we'll be able to heat the clinic, the school, maybe tribal offices, using a system like this. We also have tree improvement. When the BI started, they just got seed from wherever they could, or little seedlings, and plant them. But we want to make sure we have Quinault trees and seedlings because environmentally, they're most suited to our land. And so we do have a seed orchard now, and we do collect seed. It's been in operation for many years now. We do not have a nursery. We do contract with companies in Washington and Oregon to grow our trees for us. And it takes a lot of skill, and we let them have the risk because of diseases and insects and everything else. So we have specifications, and then for our plant tree seedlings that we provide the seed to them for, they grow it, and then we outplant it during the winter months. At one time, we were planting 1.5 million trees a year, but now we're planting less than that because we've kind of caught up with a lot of our backlog. And now we have a lot of trees where formerly we had fallow ground. We're also working with Quinault people to get them more involved in the programs. And we have a GIS system, Geographic Information System, where we can take maps and put ownership, soils, rivers, roads, almost anything that you can map, we can put a layer on and put that map together so we can manage the property more efficiently. And we've established a forest management plan to ensure that we're going in the right direction and we follow guidelines and to the best to keep the land in a healthy state. We work with the school. We take a lot of kids out on field trips. This is an opportunity for them to see in the field what goes on every day. So that will stimulate them, hopefully get more interested in our natural resources program. But one of the core issues is land ownership. And remember I said they established the reservation, but they broke it up into allotments, and that has created real problems. This is what the reservation looked like after the 1873 survey, and you can see up here there's a wedge of a light yellowish color, and that was supposed to be the original survey line, and that was left out of the reservation on this original survey. Then through the Dawes Act, or the Indian Allotment Act, the reservation was broken up into 80-acre allotments. So all these little squares are 80 acres. Here's the 2,000-acre experimental forest that the Henry Steer set up for the Quinault Nation. They owned the lake and a few little pieces of property scattered around. So there were 7 different tribes that were allotted on the reservation. So by 1974-75, the reservation looked something like this. The red are fee lands. During the 1950s, during the Eisenhower administration, they could easily transfer your land from trust to fee, and a lot of timber companies went in and bought up some of the land on the reservation. Also, the original owners were dying, and so in 1974 we had an average of 15 owners on each 80-acre allotment. Today we have upwards of 40 owners. We have people that own 1-2 million of an interest. So the land has become very fractionated, broken up, and it does not suitable for management. However, some of you may remember, if you were around in the mid-1980s, there was a thing called the Iran-Contra affair, where they were taking money from Iran and buying weapons for the Contras, a secret program. And one of the people involved in the Iran-Contra affair, his name was Richard Secor. He made a lot of money off of the deals going back and forth between Iran and the Contras. And they even put a card game out. He was one of the characters in the card game. He tried to buy land on the Quinault Reservation with some of these funds that he had got through these Iran-Contra dealings. Because of that, the deal fell through, but the Quinaults were able to then go in and buy that same land, which became known as the Iran Gate Forest. We also have the north boundary was reestablished. Court case after court case said, yes, that was an erroneous survey. But in 1989, we reestablished the northern boundary, and I'll show you a little more about that here in a moment. But we're able also to go out and buy all the Weyerhaeuser's land, ITT Rainier land, Pacific Lumber and Shipping. There's still one large landowner on the reservation, but we've been buying land to try to reclaim the Quinault. So in 2005, here's the north boundary, but we see this part wasn't left. That was national park. And there's some state land. So in lieu of those lands, the Forest Service set this up as a management area, and the tribe receives 25% of the proceeds which come off of that. The fee lands now are white. You can see this is the last major one. That's Anderson, Middleton. All the tribe are dark green, and still the individual allotted lands are light green. We still manage on all these as trust lands. So the north boundary came to the Quinaults after that deal, but then they found out there's a lot of endangered and threatened species within the north boundary, such as northern spotted owl and Marmor murrelet. And so we set up conservation areas, and we won't log those, and the federal government then is provided the tribe funds for not logging those particular lands. These monies then are used to buy more land on the lower reservation, so it's under tribal control eventually. We have environmental protection, so we make sure we don't get siltation into rivers and streams at critical times. We have a boat wash ashore. We don't want oil spilling out. We do have endangered species such as spotted owl on the reservation and Marmor murrelet, and threatened species such as eagles, which are becoming much more common year by year. We do have a title called Title 51, which controls hunting regulations and wildlife on the reservation. We have programs to monitor things such as cougars, what their impact are. We have cougars that are radio collared. You can see the radio collar on top of them there. And this is to see what kind of role they play in game management. Well, the timber industry took a downturn in the late 1980s, partly because of endangered species and partly because of more mechanization in the forest. And they put more emphasis on other things such as minor forest products, but today we call them specialized forest products, such as bear grass and cedar, ferns, and different things that we cut for basketry. There's also a lot of food that comes out of the forest, such as berries and mushrooms and camas and blackberries, and a lot of medicinal plants. We're currently doing an ethnobotany book for the Quinaults that talks about all these plants and their uses. We've also established a hazard mitigation. On the reservation, we're looking at tsunamis, earthquakes, windstorms, wildfires, landslides, and unusual weather occurrences. And so we do have a large plan in place now to control this. One of the things that we're also faced with today is invasive species, such as European gypsy moth, Atlantic salmon, which are now escaping some of these pens in Canada and getting into the rivers, and European green crab, which can be devastating to shellfish. So these are just some of the animals, and we also have a lot of plants, and one of the most notorious ones right now is Japanese knotweed. Sometimes they call it Mexican bamboo because eventually it forms almost a bamboo stalk, and it makes it very difficult to get to the river. So we have an entire section in our forestry program that deals with nothing but invasive plants now. And the other thing is climate change. This is the headwaters of the Quinault River. In 1927, it entirely filled the Anderson Basin. 65, it melted away. In 2004, there was just a snowfield. The glacier's gone. This year, we have about 4% normal snowfall in the Olympics, so this could have very dire consequences for the rivers this summer. Quinault River is already way below normal right at this moment. So we're faced with changing climate, and how are we going to adapt our programs to meet this changing climate as we watch the glaciers rot away to just snowfields. So as I said, snowpack is critical to a lot of the fish in the salmon river, in the Quinault and Queets rivers and other rivers. So this is the center of the tribal governments in Tahoe. So just who is the Quinault Indian Nation? It's made up of 7 tribes. This includes the Quileute, Queets, Quinault, Chinook, Chehalis, Cowlitz, and the Hoh River. So these tribes make up the Quinault Indian Nation. So these people, members of these tribes, can come to the General Council and vote as long as they are members of the Quinault Nation. And the Quinaults are under the Constitution of the United States are a sovereign nation. And this has been reaffirmed by the Supreme Court. So as a sovereign nation, the Quinaults can deal on a one-to-one basis with governments such as county, state, and federal governments. We have attended the White House Tribal Nations Conference of all the recognized tribes. And since we are a sovereign nation, people like our President Fawn can meet directly with the President of the United States, Barack Obama in this case. The Quinaults meet annually at the end of March each year in the General Council meeting. This is when elected officials, the officials are elected, and major topics of concern are brought forth for discussion. The elected officials make up the business committee. This is the current business committee for the Quinault Nation. They meet, seems like every day, but they have scheduled meetings for the business committee twice a month, but they do meet much more often in legislative sessions, other things that go on to run the daily activities of the Quinault Nation. Joe Delacruz was one of the predominant leaders in the 70s and 80s at Quinault, and he fought for self-governance and independence from the federal government. Jim Jackson was the Quinault president or chairman in the 1960s, and Pearl was the late 1980s and 1990s. And currently, Fawn Sharp is the president of the Quinault Indian Nation. In 1988, a federal investigation, a congressional investigation, looked at funds going to Indian reservations. And they found that only 10% of the funds allocated to reservations ever made it there. Most of it was consumed by the BIA bureaucracy before it ever arrived there. And this initiated the self-governance program where tribes could go directly to Congress and apply for funds to operate programs. And one of the things the Quinaults want to manage was tribal government, natural resources, and health care. So we began to take over more of these programs that had been operated by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to meet this. We also have a strategic plan that's been established. And the strategic plan is our roadmap to where we want to go to ensure that we have job opportunities for young Quinaults who are graduating today. Of course, we have enterprises, and most of you are familiar with that since you work within enterprises. We have the Quinault store, the fish house. We now have Q-Mart 2 in Aberdeen. And of course, we have the Quinault Beach Resort. The Quinaults, between tribal government and enterprises, have about 750 employees. That makes us the largest employer of Grace Harbor County currently, today. We do have a small museum in Taholah that contains a lot of the cultural heritage, a lot of photographs, so people can come there and study. Our visitors can see some of the things that Quinaults have. Quinaults want to maintain their lifestyle the way they traditionally do, with the way they cook fish, their artwork. Each July, we have Taholah Days. This is a big celebration that commemorates the signing of the treaty in 1855 on July 1st. So we're not really celebrating Independence Day, we're celebrating Taholah Days. And we've had canoe journeys. This has allowed young people the opportunity to be out onto the ocean and see what it's like for their ancestors and the things that we do. In 2013, the Quinaults did host canoe journeys. We fed a lot of people. We had thousands of people here in attendance. And it was a great time. So this is the land of the Quinault. It extends all the way to the upper watersheds of the Quinault River on the Queets and the Quinault, and to the highest peaks of the Olympic Mountains and lakes. And it flows down from these places to form larger rivers, which become the Quinault or the Queets rivers. The Quinault, of course, then flows downstream into Lake Quinault, and then onward across the reservation through forest to the coast. So this is land of the Quinault, and it's been the land of the Quinault since the time of the first moon, and it'll be the land of the Quinault until the time of the last sun. So I hope this has given you a quick overview of some of the things that are going on in Quinault, how it came about, and what are going on today. Thank you.